What's up, vinyl community? Welcome back to Dad's on a Budget Vinyl. Tonight we got a great conversation, I hope. My name is Mark. I appreciate you coming back and hanging out and spending some time. And, tonight I want to talk about country rock. And, I've got purple Volkswagen syndrome with this subject. So, what that is like, you've never seen a purple Volkswagen, and all of a sudden you see one, and then you're driving down the freeway and you see three more in the next hour. I thought that country rock. I mean, I know we did some alternative stuff and stuff, alt country and Americana, but country rock is something that I didn't think we had done a lot of videos. And then what do you know? Mazzy did one last week, and then I noticed Headley guy, man, you've got like five or six, of the greatest country rock albums that you've never heard, and man, I dig those. That country funk record. So country rock, right? What a great conversation. And I've seen some pretty good arguments about what is and what isn't country rock. And the other day I got on, pulled my phone out and typed in top 100 country rock artists. And what I got was top 150 country rock artists. And I was like, oh, this is going to be cool. And I clicked on it. And man, I'm sorry, in my opinion, half of those artists are not, country rock. I mean, to some people, like Americana, Southern rock, country rock, outlaw country, it's all kind of the same thing, and it's really it's really not. Number one on that list was Johnny Cash. I love Johnny Cash. Johnny Cash may have had a rock and roll or even a punk attitude, but he certainly wasn't country rock. And Waylon and Willie, I mean, they're outlaw country, and there's a big difference. And Allman Brothers and Leonard Skinner. I mean, Leonard Skinner is Southern rock, and the Allman Brothers are a thing of their own, primarily blues. I mean, Ramblin' Man is the only thing that they did that came even close to what you would call, in my opinion, country rock. So I definitely don't see them as a country rock band. You had Son Volt and Wilco and Uncle Tupelo, and even if we're just talking about the first Wilco record, and most of Son Volt's body of work, and certainly Uncle Tupelo, the band that spawned both of those bands, those guys were alt country. Well, what's the difference, Mark? Well, alt country is going to take elements of punk and alternative music and blend it with country elements. And we've talked about Americana. Country rock. What is country rock? Well, we're going to get into that. But before we do, I really just want to kind of say what I think country rock isn't, okay? I don't think that Johnny Cash or Merle Haggard or Willie Nelson or the Allman Brothers or Leonard Skinner or Atlanta Rhythm Section or Marshall Tucker or Molly Hatchet or 38 Special or Wilco or Uncle Tupelo or I don't think any of those bands are country rock. And I think it was nailed. I think it was best said that, what is country rock? Well, it's country music played with a rock and roll rhythm section, right? So you've got an electric plugged in bass as opposed to a double bass most of the time. You've got a rock drum kit, and you've got, maybe, rock and roll production, certainly on some of these records that we're going to talk about. Another definition I think that's really good, and I think that these records are going to support, is that it's country music played by hippies or rock and roll kids. A lot of these guys, they grew up in households where country music was played. Hank Williams and Hank Snow and Jim Reeves, and even, on forward to George Jones. And, and they grew up on that music, and maybe when they were teenagers, they were like every other teenager. They rejected what their parents loved, and they were into rock and roll. But some of that other music kind of seeped in. and crept in and absolutely shaped what they would do in the future. And I think that best describes it, because on some of the best country rock records that we're going to talk about, there's not a whole lot of rock. There's just not. Okay, couple of bands rock pretty hard that we're going to talk about, but for the most part, it's country music played by hippies and or rock and roll kids. Okay, so before we dive in, the big question is, who did it first, right? Was it Michael Nesmith? Was it Graham Parsons? Was it Chris Hillman? Well, all of those people were pretty early in the game. Chris Hillman brought Time Between to the Byrds' Younger Than Yesterday record in 1967. And of course, Chris Hillman cut his teeth playing bluegrass music, and that's a song that he definitely brought to the band. So it had been around for a while, but it was recorded in 67. So that's pretty early on. For me, I've got to go with the Springfield. I've got to go with Buffalo Springfield. And there's several reasons for that. And by the way, before we dive into these records, and I can't wait, they're great records to talk about. But, if you're part of the VC, you've probably seen these records. You probably can pick all of the records that I'm going to pull. And I think I've got close to 20 of them here. Okay, I think I do have 20. These records, and you could talk about these records ad nauseum. Again, this is Dad's on a Budget vinyl. This is for people that are starting off building a new record collection, perhaps maybe some novice, record collectors or music lovers or whatever. I've got people that have commented that are 17, 18, 19 years old, and I really dig that. And so they don't know all these stories. And so I'm going to go ahead and scratch the surface on some of them. Buffalo Springfield, Atco Records, 1966. And we know the story about how, Stephen Stills and Richie Furay were driving one way, and Bruce Palmer and Neil Young were driving the other, and Neil Young's hearse, and they recognized each other, pulled over on the side of the road, and the next thing you know, Buffalo Springfield was formed. I'm not calling Buffalo Springfield a country rock band. I'm not going to do that, but Go and Say Goodbye, Sit Down, I Think I Love You, Nowadays Clancy Can't Even Sing, and the excellent Pay the Price, Which Inside too. Those are country songs. I mean, those are songs that Buck Owens could have been doing. They definitely have some country leanings. And when we're discussing the rest of these records, I'm reminded of Mazzy and Headley did the Ye Olde English folk video, and they talked about how incestuous that scene was. These people played with these people, and they're all on this record, and then they're in this band. And it's the same thing with this scene. It really is. And people talk about who's the godfather of country rock. Is it Graham Parsons? Chris Hillman would say no, right? Is it Chris Hillman? Is it Michael Nesmith? Let's talk about it, and let's talk about what names Bernie Ledden that we're going to mention over and over and over. But this is a great record. It's a fantastic record. It's a little bit psychedelic. It's a little bit rock and roll. Of course, it has the huge hit For What It's Worth, written about the scene on the Sunset Strip at the time. But it definitely has some country leanings. And the amazing thing is they pretty much do it with very little pedal steel. So Buffalo Springfield, 1966, Atlantic Atco Records. The next thing that I want to talk about, I know I'm dying to go to that one, but we've got a couple of things that we have to talk about before Sweetheart of the Rodeo. So the Springfield record came out in 66. The Byrds' Younger Than Yesterday with the song Time Between came out in 67. Several other things, and I know we're going to talk about Bradley's Barn and that type of thing, but nobody's talked yet about The Great Speckled Bird. And I only have it on CD. I'm sure this has been reissued. An original copy goes for God knows what these days. Basically, Ian and Sylvia Tyson, a Canadian duo, married duo that had been singing and performing folk music since 1959. But times change and music change. And Ian Tyson, born in British Vancouver, was a rodeo cowboy and had an accident. Got thrown off a bull and got beat up pretty bad. And while he was recovering from that, learned how to play guitar, and that's how he became a musician. So the country thing, cowboys and all of that went with it kind of were just a part of his life and his upbringing anyway. They had major success as Ian and Sylvia as a folk duo. In 1968, they decide that they want to go in a new direction. They owe Vanguard Records one last record. They do the Nashville record, which came out 2 months before Sweetheart. A lot of people think that's the first time, other than Nashville Skyline, or not Nashville Skyline, but brain fart, old guy moment. Anyway, the first time that Nashville musicians came together with rock and roll players. But, Ian and Sylvia, of course, weren't seen as rock and roll players at that time. They get together to make this record. It's produced by Todd Rundgren, and it's on the Impex label. Came out in 1968, and as you notice, there's no mention of Ian and Sylvia on the record label. It's just, on the record cover, it's just Great Speckled Bird. It did absolutely nothing. It sold nothing. And as a matter of fact, boxes and boxes of this record sat in the warehouse unopened for years and years and years, until finally this scene was kind of rediscovered and these names were kind of repopularized. And the next thing you know, those records are going for it. But this is killer. It's loud. It's in your face. And of all the records that we're going to talk about, it definitely brings the rock more than any of the rest of them. Primarily due to Buddy Cage's steel guitar work and Amos Garrett's guitar work. Absolutely fantastic. The drums are huge. Indy Smart II just pounding away. This blasts out of your stereo. Of course, it was produced by Todd Rundgren, and this was early on in his production days, but you can tell he already had the touch. The music pretty much leaps out of the speakers. I'd love to have this on vinyl. I don't have it on vinyl. I'll take the CD. It's fantastic, but love what you're doing, child. Calgary. Of course, and everybody knows, Four Strong Winds. That's not on this record, but that was the big Ian and Sylvia track that Connor Oberst later did with Bright Eyes. But Ian and Sylvia, Great Speckled Bird. This is a fantastic record. If you don't know it, check it out, okay? And then before we talk about Sweetheart, another Byrds connection, Gene Clark, and I'd love to have this on vinyl too. And of course, it's been reissued, but I've got the 2 for CD, Dillard and Clark, The Fantastic Expedition, and Through the Morning, Through the Night. The first one, The Fantastic Expedition, in my opinion, is a 4.5-star record. It's absolutely fantastic. It's just right as the needle drops, or I guess as the lens plays or whatever. Out on the side, She Dark the Sun, and then of course you got the tongue-in-cheek Don't Come A-Rollin'. Train Leaves Here This Morning. Some of Gene Clark's best songwriting, in my opinion, is on this record, and I love Gene Clark as a songwriter. I know the vinyl community does at large. What a wonderful writer and singer. Always writes in that minor key, which I believe. And I want to take just a quick moment and look at something on this record, because I think that I'm right about this, but I don't want to get it wrong. So we've got Bernie Leadon on this as well. Graham Parsons, Chris Hillman, Bernie Leadon, to some extent, Steve Stills, Richie Furay. Those are names that we're going to talk about over and over and over. But the musicianship on this is wonderful. The songwriting's wonderful. The production's wonderful. And of course, like most of these records that we're going to talk about, when it came out, it did peanuts. Dillard and Clark, and there's a story. Dillard and Clark, you know, Doug Dillard from the Dillards and Gene Clark from the Byrds, and they both had been doing music for a while, and they got together. And of course, you make an album back then, you got to tour. You got to tour the record. You know, you got to get it out there. And the very first night that they're scheduled to play a show, they decide to meet up at the little Italian restaurant next door and start doing vodka shots at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. At about 5 or 6 o'clock that afternoon, somebody decides it's a great time to drop acid. And so by the time they opened, the show started playing that night about 9, 10 o'clock. You've got Gene Clark sitting on a bass amp staring at the back wall, and you've got Doug Dillard smashing his banjo and just da-da-da. They almost weren't allowed to come back after the first night, but they sobered up. They didn't do they didn't do a repeat on the second night. They came back and killed it and made a huge name for themselves locally. But as usual, Gene Clark didn't want to travel. He only wanted to play as far as they could drive in a half a day or so. And so pretty much there goes that. So Dillard and Clark. All right, let's talk about what a lot of people consider is the biggie, and that's, you know, Sweetheart of the Rodeo. So, you know, first of all, my story with Sweetheart, man, I like the Byrds. You know, you guys, you have to remember, this is my third record collection. The first record collection, about 150 records. Most of those were like, you know, Yes and Jethro Tull, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, but also stuff like, you know, Badfinger, Bad Company, rock and roll, okay? But I had like the Byrds' greatest hits, and I knew them, you know, 8 Miles High, and of course the folk rock stuff, which I actually thought it was a little lame. I like the stuff that rocked a little bit harder. You know, you grow up, your tastes change. I certainly wasn't into the Byrds playing country music. I came to this album backwards later on after I got into John Hartford. And you guys know that I'm a John Hartford freak. I love John Hartford. I saw that he had played on this record, and I was like, well, you know what? 1968, John Hartford, I need to go back and check that out. And I did. The thing about it is, this record for me back then was too country. It was too country. And I just didn't get it. So for me, it was a hard pass, but I came back to it. And of course, I grew to love it, just like all of us did. The story behind Graham Parsons being in the Byrds, and you know, for the newbies out there, Graham Parsons met Chris Hillman in a line at the bank. They both shared the same banking manager, and they got to talking about it. Crosby had just gotten kicked out of the Byrds. Also, they had just brought in Chris Hillman's cousin, Kevin Kelly, to play on drums. I mean, basically, the Byrds, after they've had like a 3 year run of just smash hits and ruling the radio and hit after hit after hit. Now Gene Clark's gone, and now David Crosby's gone. The band is really a shambles. It's hardly even together anymore. So the next thing you know, Graham Parsons, who had kind of had an implosion of sorts with the International Submarine Band through Lee Hazelwood and his production and that type of thing, had kind of a falling out with John Cornell. And Graham Parsons being Graham Parsons. Graham Parsons, you know, inheritance kid, okay? Never had to worry about having a hit, never had to worry about being successful. He knew he was going to have money. He was the grandson of a citrus what do they call those, magnates? I got that right. Big citrus deal in Florida. And Graham Parsons didn't grow up on country and didn't grow up on the back porch and none of that stuff. He was a spoiled rich kid. And as a matter of fact, it wasn't until Jim Stafford came along and said, dude, you should do country music, and turned him on to Merle Haggard. Graham Parsons didn't even listen to country music before that. But man, let me tell you what though, the kid also has a gift, and I think you knew it. He's got the cockiness of being rich. He's got the cockiness of having the gifts that he has. He meets Chris Hillman. They need somebody. Additionally, initially they auditioned him as a piano player. Basically, the next thing you know, he's stolen David Crosby's ex-girlfriend, and he's in the Byrds. And Roger McGuinn, Jim McGuinn had this idea to do an album featuring all types of American music, from ragtime, bebop, jazz, country, all this kind of stuff. And through Graham Parsons' influence, the next thing you know, they're doing a strictly country record with Charlie Daniels and John Hartford and Roy Husky and J.D. Manis and all of these wonderful players. And of course, Graham lays down some absolutely wonderful vocals and writes some wonderful songs. And him and Chris Hillman find out that they've got a really nice songwriting connection. And of course, Lee Hazelwood comes in and says, no, you're under contract with me, and those vocals have to come off, and da-da-da-da. So Roger McGuinn ends up handling the vocals. But anyway, Sweetheart came out, and everybody hated it. It wasn't rock and roll for rock. It wasn't country enough for country. These guys go to Nashville to play the Ryman Auditorium. They're basically booed off of the stage. It didn't help when Graham Parsons decided to change the set list up a little bit. They're yelling hippies and all that kind of stuff. And you think about this. This is what they actually looked like. They look like anything but hippies. But you can go on YouTube right now and you can see Ralph Emery interviewing them, and you can just feel the disgust just kind of rolling off of him. Like, what are you guys even doing here? You long-haired hippies, you don't belong on this stage. You don't belong on the Ryman or the Grand Ole Opry. Obviously, now we recognize it as a classic. And the reason that I wanted to bust out the CD is because, I've talked about Columbia's Byrds CD releases. They've all got bonus tracks. And so for the first time, this and on the Byrd set that I think came out in like 91, you've got Graham Parsons doing those vocals for the first time. But this is a lovely record. It's a fantastic record. There's a reason why I think it was on every list that I looked at, and there's a reason for it. So the Byrds, Sweetheart of the Rodeo. All right, next up, the band. I almost didn't pull the band, okay? I don't look at the band as a country rock band. I certainly might see them as an Americana band, but they're such a stew, S-T-E-W, stew. They're such a stew, with Rick Danko, Robbie Robertson's vision, his songwriting skills. The kid grew up in Canada, and yet he writes about the Deep South like he grew up here. With Garth Hudson, Richard Manuel's voice. I mean, they're just... And of course, the only Southerner in the group, Levon Helm. But, you think about it, you think about songs like The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down. You think about Rag, Mama Rag, King Harvest, just the subject matter of King Harvest. You think about Jawbone. I think that there are some country rock seeds here. And this album was so influential that I think that there's just no way that we can't include it. And I think that the band's first record and this record, I think that both of them pretty close to 5 out of 5 stars. I'd give the first one 5 and this one probably 4.5. But the band, self-titled, this is a fantastic record. Next up, the biggie, the Gilded Palace of Sin, the Flying Burrito Brothers. So, we talk about how incestuous how close-knit, we'll say, this group is. And so, you've got Chris Etheridge, you've got Graham Parsons, you've got Chris Hillman, um, and then you've got Sneaky Pete Kleinau running his pedal steel through all manner of effects. The sound just absolutely leaps out at you. And, the songwriting, I mean, Graham Parsons, all of them in their nudie suits. What an iconic cover. Graham Parsons gave us, kind of the same thing to country rock that John Hartford brought to bluegrass, with 1971's Aeroplane. Country music, and one reason that the country music establishment hated this type of stuff, hated Sweetheart, hated all of that, is because you were supposed to, it was just a very buttoned up affair, a very reverential affair. Hippies didn't have any place in it. Counterculture, we're not buying into it. We're country, by God. And these guys came along, and Graham Parsons, though, could write a beautiful country song, but it's going to include references to the city, gold-plated doors, hippies, politics, drugs. I mean, on his nudie suit, and everybody from Porter Wagner to Jimmy Martin, everybody in Nashville that was anybody had a nudie suit, okay? Nudie being the designer of and the sewer and tailor of this clothing. But, you look at Graham Parsons. He's got pot leaves and two-and-alls and crosses and, just all kinds of pop culture references. You just didn't do stuff like that, okay? But again, it was too country for the rock crowd, and it was too rock for the country crowd. And, Graham Parsons, who had already bailed on the International Submarine Band, left them hanging. Then he bailed on the Byrds. They were headed down to South Africa, and he said, "No, I think I'm going to wing on over to London and jam with the Stones." So he bailed on the Byrds. Now he's in the Flying Burrito Brothers. He's brought Chris Hillman from the Byrds along for the ride. It's a wonderful record, though. I mean, it really does deliver. Christine's tune is fantastic. Sin City, Do Right Woman, Dark End of the Street, Hot Burrito #2. Just absolutely fantastic. So, if you've heard this record talked about ad nauseum, but if you don't own it, get it. This is a reissue. You can pick it up these days for a lot cheaper than you could 4 or 5 years ago. That's for sure. All right, next up, 1970. That was 1969. This is 1970. So, now you've got Poco. Poco, who Graham Parsons was almost in for about that long. Him and Richie Furay became good friends. Richie from Buffalo Springfield. Jim Messina, also from Buffalo Springfield, produced the last record that they did and co-wrote a couple of tracks on it. This is Rusty Young. Okay, and by the way, the jacket that he has on is in the Country Music Hall of Fame. You've got, and this is Poco's second record, you've got Timothy B. Schmidt's first appearance. Look how young that cat is, okay? But this album is fantastic. And, I don't know, from time to time a record comes out, and right at the same time another record comes out, and the thunder's kind of stolen. A good example of that is Jeff Beck's Truth came out a week after Led Zeppelin's debut record. They're almost exactly the same length long. They have the same number of songs. It's definitely the same musical approach, and they even both include a version of You Shook Me. Rod Stewart's vocals are arguably just as good as Robert Plant's. Jeff Beck's guitar is arguably just as good as Jimmy Page's, but Led Zeppelin came out a week before, and we're we're still talking about Led Zeppelin. So anyway, let's get back to Poco. This is a fantastic record, and I think Richie Furay was kind of like the George Harrison of Buffalo Springfield. You know, you had Stephen Stills, and going back to the Springfield, and we didn't really talk about that because I knew we'd be talking about some of this other stuff. You know, they were only together for 18 months before Neil Young bailed and said, hey, I'm going to do my thing, and imploded that band. But, you know, in that 18 months, they had some incendiary live shows. I mean, I wish that somebody had recorded one of those. And people that were there would say that it was kind of like Cowboys and Indians. You know, you had Stephen Stills with his, you know, his Western cut suit and his cowboy hat and his cowboy boots. And then you had Neil Young with his, you know, patched jeans and his moccasins and his buckskin jacket, you know, and the longer hair. And they would both duel on lead guitar, and it was kind of like Cowboys and Indians. Well, that band imploded because Neil Young left, and Jim Messina and Richie said, hey, let's do our thing. And Richie had a lot of material that hadn't come out on those Springfield records because the other material that was being brought to the table was just so strong. This is a fantastic record. It's fun. It's upbeat. It rocks, okay? It sounds really good. Rusty Young was Poco's answer to Sneaky Pete's, you know, Flying Burritos. The pedal steel is amazing and killer. And this is a fun record. And this is, you know, I did these in chronological order, but I'd say this record's probably top 3 of the genre as far as those popular records that we all know and love. All right, next up, and I was so glad to see Headley mention Brewer and Shipley. I love Brewer and Shipley too, and a lot of people might say, well, man, that's not country rock. Well, you know what? Let me tell you something. When I was a kid, I was born in 65, so, you know, 71, 72, 73, I'm like 6, 7, 8 years old, and every once in a while something would, you know, come through the AM radio. That's what we had, you know, in my mom's car. And it would just be different. And it would have a country feel to it. And the first few bands that I really connected with like country rock were like CCR, the Doobie Brothers with Oh Black Water, and Brewer and Shipley with One Toke Over the Line. I'd never heard like anything like that. You know, first of all, there's a reference to Jesus, which you just didn't hear on rock and roll songs very often. And, you know, but you've got Jerry Garcia, and, you know, they're a wonderful band. And the Weeds record that I believe that Headley showed is a fantastic record. This is a fantastic record. And of course, this is on the Kama Sutra label, 1970, and you know, Mike Brewer, Tom Shipley on acoustic guitars and vocals, and this record would go on to influence a lot of other bands. But it's fantastic, and I think it definitely falls into the country rock genre. So we're up to 1970. So by 1971. Stephen Stills has had it, man. I mean, Neil Young has left him in the lurch twice now, once with Buffalo Springfield. Now he's rejoined, you know, he's joined Crosby, Stills, and Nash. They put out the Deja Vu record, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, Deja Vu in 1970. And then right at the top, at the peak, I mean, they could start selling out stadiums at that time if they wanted to. And Neil says, hey, sorry guys, love you, I'm out. And so Stephen Stills is like, you know what, I'm going to do this right, and I'm going to form my dream band that can play anything. And he puts together Manassas, a band named after that famous Civil War battle. And of course, you know, Stephen Stills is a huge historian. Look again, who do we have? Again, we've got, of course, Stephen Stills, Chris Hillman, Dallas Taylor from CSNY, Paul Harris, note that name, okay, Fuzzy Samuels from CSNY, Al Perkins on that killer pedal steel, remember that name, and Joe Lala on percussion. So Paul Harris keyboards, pedal steel, Perkins percussion, But this is a fantastic record, and yes, this is my autographed copy of it. It's my favorite of all the Stephen Stills solo type stuff. It's divided into 4 sides. But in my opinion, when we're talking about country rock, side 1 and side 2, it doesn't really get any better. This band is absolutely fantastic, but the songwriting is immaculate. And as a matter of fact, in my opinion, Chris Hillman's best work, the song that he wrote with Stephen Stills that kicks off side 2, It Doesn't Matter. That's a fantastic song. The Byrds had already done it and released it as a B-side, but here they kill it. But Fallen Eagle definitely has a bluegrass feel. Jesus Gave Love Away for Free, which is as country gets. Colorado, So Begins the Task, Hide It So Deep, Don't Look at My Shadow. In my opinion, it's Stephen Stills' best side, top to bottom. Okay, from the debut, from any of it, it's his best side. Every song is perfect. Every song is perfect. And so, if you don't know this record, Manassas, it's one to pick up. I mean, it's essential. You have to have it. You'll love this record whether you like the rest of these bands or not. It just has something magical about it. The songwriting, like I say, is absolutely wonderful. Johnny's Garden. Did I talk about Johnny's Garden? I love that song. Stephen Stills had purchased Peter Sellers' English Manor, and the purchase came with a gardener named Johnny, and became a big friend of Stephen Stills, and so he wrote the song Johnny's Garden for him. So we're up to 1972, also that year. I haven't seen anybody, I don't think, talk about this band. Pure Prairie League, Busting Out, 1972. This was huge. This was huge. Falling in Love and Amy, the 1-2 punch of that song, absolutely fantastic, but the rest of the record just kind of seeps in. I mean, so first of all, you've got Craig Fuller, who would go on to put out solo records and several records with Eric Kaz, and then he would join Little Feat for their kind of second gasp in the mid-'80s, long after we had lost Lowell George. And I love those records. You've got George Powell, you've got William Hines, and then a bunch of great session players. There's string instruments on here, string arrangements on here that I didn't think were necessary because the songs stand on their own. But in 1972, there were those of that mindset that said it throw strings on it. It's got to have strings on it. It almost ruined country music there for a while. But side 1 with Jazzman, Angel Number 9, Leave My Heart Alone, and Early Morning Riser. Wonderful stuff. And then side 2 kicks off with Falling In and Out, Amy, and then has a wonderful Boulder Skies. This is a fantastic record. And if you look at the back cover, I mean, it's about as country rock as you get. And of course, you got the cowboy references. Pure Prairie League. I wonder what happened to them. Next up, also from 1972, we've got New Riders of the Purple Sage. I started to grab the Panama Red record, but in my opinion, this is my go-to. This is Gypsy Cowboy from 72. I love these photos on the back. They outdo the Eagles from the Desperado cover. Well, of course they do, because this was 2 years before that. But I love those photos. This is a great record, and this obviously has Gypsy Cowboy, but Whiskey, Groupie, Sutter's Mill, Death and Destruction. But on side 2, their version of Long Black Veil. I love it. I love it, love it, love it, love it, love it. I don't think Jerry Garcia guests on this one like he does on the other. No, Buddy Cage does the pedal steel on this one. But again, Buddy Cage, same pedal steel player from Great Speckled Bird, and his name is filtered all through these records as well. So, just a cherished record. This is the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. Will the Circle Be Unbroken? Somebody else showed Uncle Charlie, and I love Uncle Charlie. Even Mr. Bojangles, the Jerry Jeff Walker tune. But this, man, this is the stuff where the two groups came together, the new guys, the old guard. Um, you've got Mother Maybelle Carter, you've got Earl Scruggs, Doc Watson, Roy Acuff, Merle Travis, Jimmy Martin, Vassar Clements, Junior Husky, Norman the Great, Norman Blake, um, and Pete Curley. And then the younger guys, you've got the Dirt Band, which of course is Jimmy Fadden, Jeff Hanna primarily. But you've got Jim Ibbison, John McEwen, fantastic banjo player, and Les Thompson. And these guys got together. And, these guys initially reached out to these guys and said, hey, we love your music and we love to do a record. And there were a lot of them that immediately were on board. Doc Watson was immediately on board. You guys have heard me talk about Doc. I love Doc. Earl Scruggs was immediately on board. Earl Scruggs was big time on board because his son Mark wanted their band, the Scruggs band, the Earl Scruggs Revue band, to move in a rockier direction. And so he was certainly excited to meet these younger hippie fellas and see what was going on. Roy Acuff was like, nah, no way. Roy Acuff, by the way, who his song "The Great Speckled Bird" is who that band is named after. But anyway, Roy was like, nah, man, I'm out, until Earl Scruggs and Doc Watson called him and said, Roy, you need to come on down and be a part of this. This is good stuff going on. And he did, and I'm really glad that he did. But, it's all on here. Wabash Cannonball, Orange Blossom Special, Foggy Mountain, all of it. Cannonball Rag. It's just killer stuff. And it's pure country. It's pure country. There's no rock on this record, but it has to be talked about because it's just such an important record. The music is wonderful. They left all of the dialogue from the recordings, between songs. They tell little stories about how they learned it and what key to play it in, and how so and so played it and how so and so sang it. It's a very low key, down home affair. But just the professionalism that just oozes from all of them, and you can tell everybody's just having a really good time, and they're all really happy to be there. So, will the circle be unbroken? Of course, this is the original. They ended up repeating this concept two other times. They may have done a fourth one now. I know there's a volume 2 and a volume 3. With like Ricky Skaggs and Jerry Douglas and Bela Fleck and people like that. But that right there is a wonderful place to start. Let's talk for a moment about Cowboy. And of course, I found out about Cowboy because I had the Duane Allman anthology, I believe it was volume 2, that had the Please Be With Me song on it, which I just absolutely loved that song. I mean, I would play it ad nauseum. His slide solo on it's so great, but it's just such a great song. Finally, one day, I picked up a record or two of theirs in a cutout bin, and they're fantastic. This album is actually a twofer. This is Why Quit When You're Losing, but it's actually a repress of Reach for the Sky, or a combination of Reach for the Sky and Five Will Get You 10 on the Capricorn Records. And of course, it's got Please Be With Me on it. But this is a fantastic record. Scott Boyer and Tommy Talton are the two primary players and songwriters in Cowboy. And they are fantastic musicians, fantastic songwriters. Their songs are so good that you wonder if maybe one or both of them couldn't have become like great fiction writers, but just very descriptive and very cool, and the music is fantastic. And I loved a lot of the stuff on the Capricorn label. The Allman Brothers recorded on Capricorn as well, and it did make me feel like they were a Southern band, okay, but I never thought of them as a country rock band. So Cowboy, if you don't know them, check them out. Again, Graham Parsons, Grievous Angel, and I love this record. And you have to think that this record was supposed to be huge. I mean, it features Linda Ronstadt. It's 1974, and Linda Ronstadt's on it. Now, Emmylou Harris is one thing. Um, Linda Ronstadt was the queen of the pop world in 1974, and she was doing some very country rock type material as well. But here's Graham Parsons back with the solo record of his, cosmic American music, and wow, man, and so again, I wanna point out, you've got the excellent guitar work, of course, of James Burton. You've got Herb Peterson is on here. Of course, you've got Emmylou Harris and the aforementioned Linda Ronstadt. You've got Byron Berlin. You've got Al Perkins on pedal steel. All of those same guys. Again, it's just a trip. Uh, Fantastic record, but again, you've got Bernie Ledden is on it as well, doing playing banjo, mandolin, guitar, background vocals. This is a fantastic record. It'll make you cry. Return of the Grievous Angel, Brass Buttons, $1,000 Wedding. I mean, I think that this record right here, you know, I think Ryan Adams probably holds this in a pretty high esteem. But it's a fantastic record, and it's exactly what you want from a good country rock. It's a little bit uplifting sometimes. It's a little bit it's tearing your beers other times, but it's a fantastic record. It's recorded really well, and it's become a classic. When it came out, it sold nothing. It sold nothing, and neither did GP. So Graham Parsons, Grievous Angel. So who took Graham Parsons' place in the Flying Burrito Brothers? Well, that would have been Rick Roberts. Who discovered Emmylou Harris and said, hey, Graham, you got to hear this chick I heard in this bar last night? Well, that would be Rick Roberts. Rick Roberts, who formed the band Firefall and took this music to a whole nother level, well, that would be Rick Roberts. This record, Rick Roberts, She Is a Song, probably would be talked about on the same level as the rest of these records if it was a little better. I don't know. The sequencing is off. It's recorded well, but the side one starts off with West Wind, which is almost like an attempt at like a country reggae song, and for me it just doesn't work, and it takes me out of the mood entirely. Now I get back into it. The best thing to do, I think, is buy this record and skip the first song. But anyway, it's produced by Chris Hillman. There you go. Imagine that. And who are the players on here? Oh, look, there's Paul Harris. Oh, look, there's Al Perkins, Kenny Passarelli, Joe Lala, Joe Walsh, Chris Hillman. They redo Stephen Stills' excellent 4 Days Gone on this album. I don't know if I would have done that. That's a wonderful song, and in my opinion, Steve Stills' version really can't be touched. But The Captain, Sweet Maria, Glad to Be Going, Lights. This is a great little record, and Rusty Young is also on it, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. So it's all the players. It's everybody doing what they're supposed to be doing. It's good songwriting. I just probably would have done things a little bit differently, and I think we would have had a different result. But Rick Roberts is a big name in the name of country rock, and probably should get a little bit more credit than he does. Next up, let's talk about Mule Skinner, okay? And that's the great Clarence White of the Byrds on the back cover. You've got Richard Green, Bill Keith, David Grisman, Tony Rowan. Who did I forget? Oh, and the great Clarence White. So, well, how did this record come about? Mule Skinner. What's Mule Skinner? Well, in 1974, they wanted to do a TV special featuring the old and the new. Will the Circle Be Unbroken had come out, and now all of a sudden this kind of idea of the old guard meets the new guard, the hippies meet the conservatives, that type of thing, had kind of taken off a little bit, and they wanted to do a program featuring a younger group of bluegrass guys with Bill Monroe's bluegrass boys and an older group of bluegrass guys. Okay, Bill Monroe's bus broke down on the way to the filming, and Mule Skinner played a set by themselves, and it was recorded. You can see it on YouTube. The playing is absolutely fantastic, and it was so good that they were told, "Hey, why don't you guys cut an album?" And they did. This didn't come out until 4 years later. I'm not really sure what the story is behind that. I'll find out. But this is an album that you have to have. The music just absolutely leaps out of your stereo. Clarence White's guitar, it just crackles like it's just like a thing alive. It's a wonderful thing. And all of these players are at the top of their game and masters of their of their instruments. Uh, David Grisman's one of my favorite mandolin players of all time. Peter Rowan, who not just as a personality and a songwriter and a singer and a guitar player, just the whole package. Richard Green's violin. Of course, they both came from C Train, but Richard Green had played with Bill Monroe, so had Peter Rowan. And Clarence White, of course, we know is fantastic guitar playing from those later Byrds records, and as a matter of fact, one of the only redeeming qualities on some of those records. But Mule Skinner, if you don't know this, check it out. You can watch some stuff on YouTube about them, and then seek this record out because it is a corker. Next up, David Geffen's Asylum label, and this was meant to be huge, lots of production money. So who do you have? Well, you've got J.D. Souther, co-wrote several huge, massive Eagles tracks. You've got Chris Hillman again. You've got Richie Furay again. On the back, you've got Paul Harris, Jim Gordon of Derek and the Dominoes fame, wrote that excellent coda to Layla. You've got Al Perkins on pedal steel again, and Paul Harris on keyboards again. I like this record. I really do like this record. It sounds a little bit dated, but J.D. Souther's a great songwriter. All of these guys are good songwriters. Of course, they had solo gigs also. They were putting out solo material at the same time. And so I know, that just like the Byrds reunion record, where they probably were saving all of their best material for records that they would put out solo, but there's some strong songwriting on this. I'm not a huge fan of track one, side one. I'm sorry. Fallen in Love, track one, side one is great. Heavenly Fire, the Chris Hillman song, is great. I'm not real fond of the J.D. Souther song, The Heartbreaker, but Border Town, which ends side one, is a fantastic record. This is a fun little record, and this is a little bit later in the game, so the production is a little better. It's a little slicker. The vocals sound better. The guitars sound great. The drum's not as good and the keyboard's not as good, right? That's just kind of what we dealt with at that time. But Southern Hillman Furry, like I said, they were supposed to be huge. The production machine, I mean, they had billboards on, but for some reason, whatever reason, I guess they just didn't do that good. All right, Emmylou Harris, Pieces of the Sky, her first record. And yeah, this record is a little bit more traditional country than her second record would be, but all of the elements are in place. Her hot band is in place. Rodney Crowell's on board. Bernie Ledden is on board. I wish there were a few less covers, but everything on here is great. Bill Payne's here from Little Feat. Ricky Skaggs is here. Danny Pendleton is here. Ben Keith is on it. James Burton, like we said. Herb Peterson's on it. Ron Tutt plays drums. There's another name. And of course, Bernie Ledden's on it, playing banjo. Fantastic record. And Emmylou Harris, I have to say, I've got a bunch of Emmylou stuff, and I've, from this all the way through probably like Wrecking Ball, the trio record with Dolly and Linda, and a bunch of her stuff. And I love Emmylou Harris. I can't take her in large doses, but when I'm in the mood for Emmylou Harris, nothing else delivers, okay? That plaintive vocal style, and her, of course, her duets with Graham Parsons. And, I was telling about Rick Roberts saying, hey, Graham, you got to come hear this girl I heard in a bar the other night. And, of course, they did. And Graham Parsons got up and sang a duet with her, and I forget what the song was, but I think there were like 3 people in the club to hear the first time they sang together. Next up, we got to talk about the Eagles, okay? And someone else showed their debut, someone else showed Desperado. I'm going to show One of These Nights because this is the last record that they did with Bernie Leadon. I think that Bernie Leadon is the undisputed hero, or the not undisputed hero, but maybe, I don't know. I just think we need to shine a light on Bernie Leadon. He's on half these records. It was wonderful. He left the Eagles because he wanted to play more traditional country and bluegrass music. And of course, when he left, they brought in Joe Walsh, and the Eagles became a whole nother band. When it comes to country rock, whether you've heard the Eagles ad nauseum, whether you're sick of them, love them, whatever, they did country rock, what we know of as country rock, as good as anybody. And then they had a little help along the way, starting off, the Stone Ponies as Linda Ronstadt's backing band, and, then come along with a little help from Jackson Browne, a little help from J.D. Souther, a little help from Joe Walsh, but this core, and at this point, you've got Don Henley, Don Felder, Glenn Frey, Bernie Leadon, and Randy Meisner. And this album, to me, was too country when it came out for me to get into it. Take It to the Limit, One of These Nights, Lion Eyes, all of those songs were huge on the radio, and they were all a little bit too country for me. I was ready for Joe Walsh. Of course, now my tastes have changed, and I love both of those elements. I love both of those times. Probably my favorite track on the record, though, is still After the Thrill Is Gone. But the Eagles, man, One of These Nights. And the Eagles, country rock. The Eagles, country rock. I mean, come on. Last but not least, Firefall. We talked about Rick Roberts. Rick Roberts formed Firefall with Jock Bartley, David Muse, Mark Andes, and it was almost like they said, you know what? Let's do some of the same stuff that we did, because Rick Roberts was in the Flying Burritos for quite a while before he went solo and then formed Firefall. And it's kind of like they got together and said, you know what, let's do music like we did in the Burritos and these other things, but let's kind of Steely Dan it up a little bit. Let's add some flute, let's add some electric piano, some Fender Rhodes and some Yamahas, and that type of thing. It's a little slicker, it's a little prettier, but I think it's infinitely interesting. This is the album Lunacy, and this had the huge hit Just Remember I Love You. But I've got all of Firefall's records. They're one of my guilty pleasures, and I think they're a lot of fun. And so there you go, 20 country rock records. Now, I love the Headley videos where they're literally the 5 country rock records that you've never heard. And I think he's got 5 or 6 of those now, and I love those records. These are the slap you in the face. This is country rock type stuff, okay? So if you don't know this genre, dive in. It's a lot of fun. Going back and forth and seeing the common threads that run through these records is a lot of fun. And I've enjoyed listening to these records for a long time, and will continue to do so. You guys have a great weekend. Have a great time doing whatever it is you're doing. I appreciate you hanging out with me tonight, and can't wait for us to get together again. In the meantime, if you like the content, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and more importantly, comment. I love the comments. Keep those coming. They inspire me to continue to put up new stuff. All right. Y'all take care. We'll see you next time. Bye.